Hi, everyone. Thanks for your patience. We got started a little bit late. I apologize for that, but thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Helen Seslowski. I'm the Events Director for Oblong Books. And before I welcome our guests this evening, I have a few instructions for any of you who've not attended our events before. If you'd like to ask a question at any time during the course of the conversation, just pop it in the chat, which you'll find at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And we'll address it at the end of the program. There's also an Ask a Question module at the bottom of your screen, and you can pop a question in there too, and we'll be sure to catch that at the end. We're delighted this evening to welcome Elias Rodriguez, who'll be talking with his editor, Alane Mason, about his debut novel, All the Water I've Seen is Running, which was published on, thank you, on June 22nd. You can keep that held up there by W.W. Norton. And for those of you who'd like to purchase a signed copy, there's a green Buy the Book button at the bottom of your screen. So we hope you will. And if you prefer to listen to your literature, there's a link to purchase the audiobook through Libro FM, and that's in the chat, and you can find that there. So without further ado, Elias Rodriguez is a scholar of African American literature with special interests in critical prison studies, Black feminism, and Black Marxist thought. He received his BA from Stanford University and recently received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Congratulations. Thank you. Also completed his Woodrow Wilson Fellowship and will be taking a new post this fall as Assistant Professor of African American Literature at Sarah Lawrence College. He's currently working on an academic book project considering representations of police violence in the African American novel after 1945. And his essays have been published in The Guardian, The Nation, Book Forum, N+1, and other venues. Alane Mason will be conducting the conversation this evening, is Vice President and Executive Editor at W.W. Norton and Company. In 2003, Alane founded Words Without Borders, an international magazine open to international exchange through translation, publication, and promotion of the world's best writing and authors who are not easily accessible to English-speaking readers. And she currently also serves as president of that organization. And with that, Alane, I'm going to hand off to you. Thank you both for coming.
Oh, well, thank you, whoever is there. Thank you for being here. It's really a thrill to be able to participate in this event and to celebrate Elias, who is such a dazzling talent. And it's really been my privilege to have the chance to be his editor and see this book come into fruition and see all the really fabulous critical attention that it's been getting. And Elias, I can't help but think that, you know, not only is all the water in this book running, but the waters also run deep, and you know your depth as a writer, but the surface of the beautiful writing and really the depth of thought and feeling that went into it is what really made me fall for it. And of course, one of your, you know, there's the depth of the life that you have led, which is been anything but a surface one, and there's the depth of everything that you've read, your depth as a scholar and critic. And I loved that interview which appeared recently with Deborah Kalb, and I love reading, you know, in reviews and author interviews after the book is published, things that I never noticed in the book or never knew about before it was published. And when you talk about, you say the distance between what the protagonist knows and doesn't know is measurable in the distance between the things that Daniel, the protagonist, alludes to explicitly, the Odyssey, the Lord of the Rings, etc., and the authors that the novel alludes to without being explicit, Toni Cade Bambara, Toni Morrison, Lucille Clifton. I thought, wow, there's that brilliant critic that I so admire, as well as the novelist. And I just would love to hear you talk about how your reading influenced your writing and how you can shift between those two modes of of being a novelist and being a critic without one kind of getting in the way of the other?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you also so much to Oblong for having me, and thank you to everyone for being here. I can't see you, but I'm really grateful that you're here. Yeah, that's a really good question, Elaine. I think, reading has got to be the best thing to do, I think, if you would like to write. I think that there's, just at a basic level, there are all sorts of things that one learns about how to write a sentence, how to write a paragraph, what kinds of characters people react to emotionally and what those kinds of reactions are. I suppose this is all old hat in a way to say that one has to read to write. But in a more concrete way, I think, I had a lot of feelings in my own life at that time. I, was sort of dealing with kind of like the first major loss of a peer, someone who I was really close to. My grandmother passed away around that time. And then in the time that I was composing that book, I was invited to, around 10 funerals, and was dealing with a lot of difficulty and loss in my own personal life, and had to kind of find a way to make sense of that. And I think that, I just kind of luckily happened upon a Gail Jones poem, like a long narrative poem, Song for a Nino, in which the orientation is effectively about how can we sort of return to the past, a past that is itself riddled with violence, and that our distance from it is partially due to violence. How can we return to that past, to the people that we love, even after they have passed away? I happened to read this book, or this poem that's also a book, because I just was a critic, and I was sort of like looking for dissertation topics, as one does, just sort of by reading widely, and that book opened up something for me. It opened up something for me emotionally, certainly. It sort of started me on a journey that I think as a person I'm still on today, of figuring out how to orient myself to a past that I know is distant, to people whom I love, who have passed on, who I can no longer talk to. And it opened up for something for me in terms of literature. I think all of this is to say, I certainly don't think one should write fiction that just is criticism. I think if you're going to write fiction, you had better do it because you can't write this thing in nonfiction, but criticism, nonfiction at the same time, it should and it has to sort of open you up to what one could write about, to ways of writing, to things that you think about. Luckily for me, I was sort of deep in the waters of Black feminism, and so much of this is about returning and working through trauma, so in the hopes of making the present better, but I think this should be the case for anyone. I think if you're not coming to criticism because it's moving you and because the text is doing something to you, then I don't know why one would go to criticism at all, either as a reader or a writer, Yeah,
that's a beautiful way of stating it. Are there particular critics who you feel have understood the book in a way that you hadn't fully understood it yourself, that have really spoken to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, okay, so I have two thoughts, or maybe three thoughts. There are two people who wrote about things before the book came out, where I was like, oh, I guess this is the book that I am writing. One is this Fred Moten line about what Black studies ought to be, which effectively, I'm deeply paraphrasing here because Fred Moten is quite abstruse, but effectively, Black studies should take seriously the kind of violence that is racism, but also subordinate it or make it lesser to celebrating like the persistence of being Black, of Blackness, of Black life. And that is, I think, in many ways, the project of the book. It's sort of anywhere and everywhere all about violence. The narrator, Daniel himself, experiences violence as a young person in the home. Of course, his uncle is killed before he's born. His beloved Aubrey passes away in a car crash. His brother is in prison. He experiences quite a bit of violence, or hears about it peripherally, and it's there in all the stories his mother tells him about his history. But so much of it, I think, is about trying to find life through and beyond that violence. It's not to pretend that it doesn't exist, but still to kind of return, at least at the end, one hopes, to something like life itself, because to only dwell on the violence or to make the violence the primary subject, I think, is a kind of pessimism, and a kind of despair that I'm not interested in, but on the other hand, to only be interested in life and happiness is also a kind of utopianism that is, I'm also not interested in. And I think it's really, you get a kind of real utopianism, for lack of a better word, in that, yes, things are bad now, but how still can we find the ways in which people persist and thrive? That was one, I think. The New York Times review that called the book a millennial noir, that was very surprising to me. I think it's really good. I read that review and I was like, oh yeah, there's certainly a detective, and certainly at various moments I had sort of thought about this as Daniel, trying to be a detective, but of course he's a failed detective. All of his friends point out that he is looking for answers to a question: how did this girl that he loved when he was in high school die? Or maybe also what happened after we fell out of touch? How have we grown apart, etc. And all of Daniel's friends are like, this is all bullshit. The answers to those questions. The answer to the question is, I'm angry, or I'm sad, but I refuse to sort of confront these emotions. And that kind of failed detectiveness. It's interesting to me that the New York Times review appends the generational description, which I think is fair. I mean, so much of it is about the sort of Florida after the 2008 crash, which admittedly, that is a sort of big hallmark of millennial Floridians, and indeed millennials. We all care about 08, it was really quite crazy to all of us, and we were sort of entering the workforce or going to college on the younger end, or losing jobs or what have you. But I will say, I think that kind of faulty searching for answers, I think that in other ways, I think it's also just true of grief and grieving. I mean, one of the really difficult things about grieving is that you ask all these questions. Who were they when they passed? Why didn't we talk more? What are the things that they said that I don't know? And you have to kind of confront that difficulty of being in the position that you can no longer ask them those questions. I think at the early stages, this can be frustrating, or it can be anxiety producing, or it can be despairing. You have all these questions and no answers. And at the end, you just ideally are in a position where you feel grateful to have known them. And I think in that way, the noir bit of the book as a detective, I think it's true that it's tinged with a particular millennial problem. But I think additionally, one of the difficult things about grieving is that it kind of makes us all into fake detectives, because of course we have to confront the fact that there are questions that we can no longer answer. You cannot call that person anymore.
Mm-hmm. The noir really surprised me, because I think of noir as generally being very hard-boiled, and the book to me is anything but hard-boiled, because it is dealing with grief, and it is such an emotional and sensitive book. But on the other hand, if I think there was a book I did some years ago called Dragonfish by Vu Tran, which if you haven't read it, I think you might really like it, because it does explicitly use the structure of a noir and sort of makes reference to the tropes of noir, but it also has this sort of a very lyrical sensibility and sensitivity to it. But I don't know if it's millennial. I think he might be 10 years older than you. But yeah, that was certainly a kind of, I definitely did a double take when I saw that headline. I thought, wait a minute, are they talking about the same book?
Yeah. It's funny, it's like Elias has invented millennial noir, and I was like, oh, that's pretty good, I guess. I invented a genre that I didn't know I was trying to invent. That's pretty cool, Yeah, I do think that description was really helpful, though, also for the way that it treats gender quite carefully.
Yes.
The kind of, the women who are constantly saving the narrator Daniel, who is at the same time himself complicit in some sexist norms or whatever sexist actions, most notably lying about a particular, how do I say this without giving anything away? Lying about, a woman whom he loves, I think that there is a kind of complicity there, which I think is true of like that noir from like whatever Raymond Carver or the like Humphrey Bogart films, and I think, the way that it describes the way that the gender norms of the book at the same time are able to sort of deal with and think about and critique that kind of old school gendered position. Because indeed, everybody in the book is constantly telling Daniel, like, what's wrong with you? At a sort of scene late in the book where they're having dinner, Daniel talks about his dreams for like a possible life that he could have had with Aubrey had she not died. And of course, this, but, Jess and Egypt, two good friends of his, are like, what is this? Like this, she was her own person. She had her own life, and she was, what is all this nonsense that you're doing here? And I think that that's about right. I think that like in many ways I was kind of interested in plumbing that kind of sexism and Daniel's own complicity with it. Cause it's important to me that he's not perfect. He makes progress and he's begun some processes to sort of rectifying past harms or maintaining close contact and intimacy where maybe he had pulled away in the past. But ultimately, he has to be a work in progress. Grieving is such a work in progress position. I think even personally, I have had my own experiences where, it's one step forward and like 30 steps back, and even sometimes still, people whom I feel that I have completely grieved, something happens. And then suddenly I'm like, oh my God, I feel this loss all over again, and that kind of progress, I think, is real. It's like none of us are really perfect. Daniel, and as much as any of us else are sort of all works in progress.
We had talked a little bit about maybe pulling out some quotes from authors you admire. Did you get a chance to do that?
I did.
Yeah, I would love to hear some of those influences, be able to have those voices in our ears. Yeah.
So this was a Audre Lorde quote from the essay Learning from the 60s. And these quotes are all like other possible epigraphs that I had written down that I'm glad I landed on the one that I did, but this would have been an interesting one, I think. So Audre Lorde writes, when I hear the deepest truths I speak coming out of my mouth sounding like my mother's, even remembering how I fought against her, I have to reassess both our relationship as well as the sources of my knowing.
Huh.
I think, to me, in a lot of the book in the present tense is about Daniel, yes, like grieving the loss of a good friend, returning to really close friends, etc. And much of the book as well is also about Daniel trying to reckon with the fact that he is a product of a history, not just a history in Florida, but of his family's history, and that he was raised by his mother alone, and that indeed the more that he talks to her, the more he is discovering about his life and also realizing that the life that he has lived is surprise, he's not the only person who's ever lived a life before. And in fact, much of his family have been through other and similar things. And so in many ways, I think this book is also a story about Daniel learning to love his mother and learning to understand what role she had in making him who he is. I think this is there sort of textually throughout, but I think to me, this is part of some of those sort of like sneakier allusions, that made their way in the Bambara or the Morrison, for instance, that on the surface, I think this might seem to be a book that's very much about Daniel, but it's actually very much about Daniel's relationship with his mother, even if he comes to learn to love her in a way that is quite strange.
So talk a little more about that, about the strangeness of Daniel's love for his mother. It's true that she's her presence in the book is strong, but of course we never see her, like she doesn't come on stage at all. She's always off stage. But we know her to the extent that we do know her through the stories that she's told Daniel. Were those stories that your mother actually told you? And what were your thoughts in kind of keeping his mother off stage?
Yeah, I think. Okay, so two thoughts. One is, nothing is all that non-fictional in the book. I mean, certainly nothing is, partially because my mom would be so pissed if I had aired our sort of like personal secrets, even under a fictional cover. My mom would be like, what is wrong with you? I had told you that in confidence and in private, not, for you to yell it in the pages of a book. Certainly, I think much of my life, though, I have had a relationship with my mother where I am learning about my past through her. Some of this is talking about relatives who had passed before I lived, and some of this is just hearing, her stories about people. And of course, one of the difficult things about getting older is, in fact, then getting to talk to other people, let's say my cousins, and, finding out that their mothers told them things that are very different about the same stories or the same people. And suddenly being convinced, on the one hand, like a plethora of information, and on the other hand, nothing. It's like, well, I wasn't there. These stories are mutually exclusive. I have no idea how to make sense of this person whom I have never and will never meet. And that's kind of one of those funny things I think about life and learning in a way, and learning to adjust to being in a family, is that ultimately we all just sort of have these stories for some of these things. There aren't maybe ways of accessing that knowledge. I think that this is also true to a greater degree for people who are products of diaspora, especially those who are products of slavery. I think there are just not good historical records about enslaved people. I mean, often, in fact, what one finds is enslaved people recorded as like monetary value in ledgers. It's hard actually to know anything about that past. Historians do a very good job, don't get me wrong. I mean, people should read Black historians. They're great at what they do, but there are real limitations about the past that I think for many of us who are Black are dramatized by our family histories. Indeed, I think much of growing up and maturing and learning that history is also learning how to work with not knowing. For Daniel, I think that's part of why his mother is off stage. Daniel sort of has to really confront, I should say also, one of the things that's nice about a book being out is that I no longer have the only opinion. I'm just sort of like up one opinion of many readers, so I no longer have the pressure of delivering a story or a meaning. So this is my opinion. I think that Daniel has to sort of confront that absence of knowing at the sort of greatest extreme, which means that his mother is not there. And indeed, even if she were, actually, some of those things are not possibly answerable. He might ask answers to questions that he can't trust her for, or maybe she just doesn't know the answers to. Additionally, I think that there is a deep desire of Daniel as a teenager who's queer, who's Black, who's experiencing racism, anti-queerness, sexism, etc. in Florida, to just escape, Some of this, I think, is imbricated with a kind of sexism in a way, Daniel repeatedly says throughout the book, like, I don't date, white people anymore, which is like really important. And that's a big part of his like new queer life in New York. And also there's a kind of hope for transcendence and sort of just like escaping, all of these really messy ties, both to like actual women that he grew up with in Florida and also his mother, who, he says he doesn't call very much. Somehow through all of this, Daniel has to sort of learn that no, returning home isn't easy, but there might be something waiting for him there if he wants to go back. Home, in this case, is, of course, Florida. It could also be his mother's home or the history that his mother is telling him about, which anywhere and everywhere, he sort of has to find a way to move from frustration with what one cannot know wonder, about all the things, all the question marks that remain, excitement, that kind of wonder, I mean.
One of the things I love about the book is the sense that, that this history is unfinished. And that's one of the things that epilogue brings to it, where the point of view totally shifts, and you have Egypt's commentary on what's gone before, in the sense, her kind of wise, wry sense that these are just young men who are still, like, they're just nowhere near finished yet, which is so great. And as we've discussed, when I first read the book, I thought, whoa, wait a minute, this is like completely out of the blue. We've been so intimately in Daniel's head for the whole book, and then suddenly in the last chapter, you're in it's such an abrupt shift that it can almost feel like you're starting another book. But once it settles, then you realize, like, how brilliant this is. And it's just, it seemed as though that not every reviewer, the only one, I guess, who had issues with it was maybe it didn't fit into the noir scheme or something. But yeah, I've just found it so powerful and beautiful. So yeah, for those of you out there, this is a book that's really worth getting all the way to the end, and the payoff is really extraordinary. And not in any kind of like cheesy tying up the knots way, but sort of just because you see in that really true way how these lives are unfinished. And I was actually looking, when I thought, oh, I better look and see if I have a quote to bring to you. And I'm reading this beautiful book by the historian Taya Miles, talking about Black historians who are doing amazing work in writing history that sometimes has to draw on very scanty records. And you would love this book, Elias, All That She Carried.
Oh, wow.
All That She Carried.
Mm.
The journey of Ashley Sack, a Black family keepsake. And it's about this embroidered sack that was given by an enslaved mother to her daughter who was being sold. And it was kept in the family, and a later descendant embroidered on it what it was. And she embroidered my great-grandmother, wait. I can't, it's too small. I can't see it. Let me find a bigger reproduction of it. It's so really powerful. I need a magnifying glass. Well, anyway, all of you, in addition to buying a license book, you have to buy Taya Miles. But she uses an Octavia Butler quote at the beginning, and from Parable of the Sower, which is, I think we should make emergency packs, grab and run packs in case we need to get out of here in a hurry. And I thought that really spoke to me about what Daniel is doing in this book. I mean, there is a sense that he and Ashley, his deceased friend Ashley, wanted to get out of where they were, and that in a way they were both helping each other to sort of make these emotional emergency sacks. Then that, in a way, Daniel's loss is that the loss of that friendship that was somehow there for him as in case of emergency. And she gets him out of some emergencies, right, during their friendship. And that reconnecting with these old friends in a way that they're all doing this for each other, kind of giving each other the strength and the power to move forward with their lives.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful quote. And that sounds exactly right to me. I mean, I think It's funny, you know, I mean, I think that like young people they're underappreciated, I think, for how much they have to deal with and also manage to deal with. You know, I mean, I think in many ways this is a book about people who, when they're younger, keep each other safe. You know, while they're all in high school, they keep each other safe. They take on each other's risks, you know, to keep each other safe and to mitigate risk. I mean, most notably, I think, you know, multiple characters sort of risk arrest and get a couple, you know, hits in the face in one fight to get Daniel out of a place because everybody's sort of worried about him losing a scholarship, which strikes me as really, this is an aside, but that it strikes me as a really, really sad and difficult thing in a way, you know, because it's like, of course, this is really wonderful that Daniel has these friends who would risk these things for him, but his life isn't worth more than theirs simply because he has a scholarship, you know, and he's not more worthy of non-arrest than others because he has a scholarship. But this is the decision that they make. And in many ways, they make this because, as you're pointing out, they do all have, they're not just, you know, physical, emotional, or they're not just physical safety packs, but everyone is a kind of like emotional emergency pack for each other, right? That like, indeed, much of who Daniel has held on to himself being, much of how he's made his way through the world, it certainly sounds like by his own tell, at least in my opinion, is that he's sort of held on really deeply to all of the things that this youth, that these teenage years have given him. You know, they've kind of provided him a sense of self. This has meant in some ways, you know, motivation for running well, for doing well in his classes, to get a scholarship. It's also meant, you know, motivation for escaping the South and moving to sort of like, you know, a sort of like urban oasis that, of course, is no oasis at all, which is to say New York. And it's also his kind of emotional emergency pack, even when he returns home, right? I mean, he finds that, you know, the place is just sort of full of all these things that are difficult, yes, but also life-giving. You know, I mean, certainly he thought of Aubrey as someone who was important to him, partially because at various moments in his life, as you pointed out, he has thought of her as someone whom he could just like call up and be like, do you want to run away from our life together? You know, like, I'm not that into what I'm doing, you know, maybe we should just get married and, you know, run away. And of course, all his friends point out that this is deeply unfair to think of her in this way because she was her own person. We find out that she was engaged. But it's true that this is how he thought of her. And it turns out that even still here at the end of the book, you know, or in the book, when he is grieving, when he's just having a difficult emotional time, even still his friends are kind of saving him. You know, they're sort of like buoying him and keeping him afloat and providing those sorts of like whatever emergency rations, all the other sorts of things one might put in an emergency pack, right? Not only by putting themselves physically on the line, but in many ways by teaching him how to grieve. You know, I mean, a lot of what they've taught him is that, you know, you don't have to do this alone, grieving or life, you know, and we don't have to be dating for you to depend on me. You know, you could be whatever, a friend, you could be, you know, a sibling figure, what have you, you know, but in many ways, much of the book is about a reminder that like, it's not just things, let's say, that one puts in one's safety packs, you know, it's also people.
Well, I realize that we're getting on in time, and so maybe we should ask if there are any questions, and if not, or regardless, I would also love to hear you just read that. I don't think I've ever actually gotten you to hear you read your own prose, and I would really love to hear you just read that first paragraph. But maybe we should close with that and first see if there are any questions.
Sounds like a plan.
Any questions?
Yep, sorry, coming up. Yes, we do have a few that people have texted through to the Ask a Question module. One of the first questions was, why did you choose Florida as a setting? Was it just familiarity because it was a location that you had a deep knowledge of growing up, or was there a particular reason for choosing it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Familiarity definitely didn't hurt, you know, but also I think, you know, in a way it's familiar and estranged to me, which was also maybe more important, you know. Oddly, like I, you know, think I started writing this when I was living in Philly, and like every once in a while would like try to write something about Philly and be like, I cannot see the city. You know, it's like, I mean, I know where it is, but I cannot actually picture it and describe it, you know, and I found that the only place that I wanted to describe, the only place where I thought those descriptions came to life were Florida. You know, I think that just as a physical landscape, as a way that people talk, you know, I mean, Florida, you can like hear in people's like mouths when they're from Florida, you know, that was really life-giving to me, you know, and I really wanted to sort of sit there and to move through that because I just wanted to do something that felt good. Because as I mentioned, you know, I started writing the book when a friend of mine had passed, and you know, the things that are good are hard to come by in that time, you know? So it was like, well, this feels great. Let me just sit with this. And I love the way that Floridians speak, you know? I think also, to me, the book and Florida are particularly important in a lot of other ways. I mean, in some ways, you know, Florida is as much the Caribbean as like whatever, Jamaica, the Bahamas, what have you, you know? And it's a place where, because of that, you can talk about diaspora in ways that are meaningful to me, you know? Because indeed, much of the book is sort of like paraphrase an Aishion Hutchinson poem. It's about a group of characters who are pitching diaspora against despair. You know, they're finding togetherness in the sort of expulsion from home. Because, of course, one can't really return once one has left. I think also Florida is really important to me because I think there was a, you know, time in which like people were just talking shit about Florida all the time. And I was like, I'm over it. Like, this is nonsense, you know? And it also struck me as like kind of bullshit. You know, people would say like, oh, well, Florida's so racist. And I'd be like, how could that possibly make any sense? You also live in like Philly or New York or what have you, you know, there are no cops here, you know? It's just like, so there was a kind of abjection that's happening there, I think, you know, where people are trying to pretend that the world that they live in or that the country that they live in isn't Florida. They can't actually face up in some ways to how Florida they are, how Florida where they live is, you know, and so setting it there really enabled me to sort of like sit in and deal with this place that is in some ways not that different. It's also in other ways very different. You know, I mean, it is a place of not liberal racism, you know, it's like explicit conservatism, you know, I mean, Confederate flags, people using the N-word derogatorily, what have you, you know. And it was important to me to sort of sit with that and to think about the people who still, through all of this difficulty, managed to eke out a dignified and meaningful existence. Because indeed, I think much of the sort of like, we should just get rid of Florida nonsense that really frustrates me sometimes is that one would then be sort of casting aside and isolating a number of people whose lives are worth saving, you know, whose lives are worth not throwing away. And that was really, really important to me about Florida, you know, that there was a kind of dignity, yeah, for lack of a better word, to like Black life, the poor Black life, Jamaican life, in that little stretch of North Florida that I felt was not being adequately represented. And, you know, kind of in that Toni Morrison fashion, you know, because there was no book about this that I could read, I had to write this book.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Having lived in Florida for a long time, I can totally get that. Yeah. Tell us about driving culture in Florida.
Yeah. Okay. This is where I have to, I want to say very clearly, I am not pro drunk driving. And of course, like, I say this because I'm about to say like weird things, and I just want to be very clear about this. But driving is sort of like everywhere in Florida, and the book sort of revolves around drunk driving accident. Aubrey Daniels' beloved dies in a drunk driving accident. In a kind of basic way, I think drunk driving seems to me pretty clearly to be like governmental neglect or infrastructural failure. You know, I mean, we know that people will drink, and if they don't have other ways of getting home, that they will drive. We could sort of create an infrastructure to save those people. We've just decided that that's not what we're going to do, you know, and so Florida just has a lot of drunk driving deaths, you know, because outside of Miami, there isn't really a public transportation network. And driving is also, in as much as it's a kind of really dangerous thing, also because there are like crazy thunderstorms every summer, you know, where sometimes like you maybe just have to pull over. The rain is so heavy, you know. It's also yeah, kind of way that young people get to take control of their lives. You know, I mean, I remember how important it was when my first friend, you know, turned 16 and got his license, you know, because it was like, wow, we get to do whatever we want now. You know, I mean, we like never had enough gas money. We were like paying in like nickels and dimes, but it was just like, who cares? We get to go where we want. I don't have to like ask my mom for shit or like ask your parents for shit or anything, you know. And so much of this book is about that, you know, and it's about that getting control of one's life and ultimately finding out that the big things and the important things are kind of the small things. You know, it's not really like what you do when you get to a place, but driving around and talking, you know, those kinds of like incremental changes, reacting to the music, that can be as important a way or as big a thing as bonding as like whatever, like getting to the beach, you know, which like ultimately you're going to do the same shit at the beach that you did in the car. You know, you'll just be a little bit more comfortable because you're not upright, you know. So to me, I think like car culture is and driving culture is, it's kind of essential to like Florida life. You know, I mean, if you've ever lived outside of, you know, any, you know, place that has public transportation, this is probably a big part of your life too. You know, I mean, it is kind of so important to get your license because it's just the first time that you and your friends get to choose what kind of lives you will lead together and what you will do together. And in that way, you know, the road is as much the future as it is a whatever piece of asphalt.
Yeah, that's true. How do you think the absence of Aubrey in the majority of the book contributed to the narrative of the book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think about this a lot. This is one of those ones where I'm really glad that I'm not the only person who gets to make the decision about what the book means. To me, I think one way that you could describe this book is that it's a story about someone reckoning with a particular history of integration in America. Indeed, of course, the South and like Richard Wright or earlier is a place of course, like great black and white proximity, you know, I mean, also during slavery. And, you know, integration does change things. You know, it means that the people who Daniel goes to school with are of a variety of races, including, of course, Aubrey, who is white. Daniel just doesn't grow up in an all black place, let's say like, you know, the setting of Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God. You know, he sort of has to confront one of the difficulties of integration in the South, which is that, yeah, you have your friends, but you also have to go to school with, you know, people who identify as redneck and wear Confederate flags to school, you know. And he happens to just strike up a close relationship with one of those people, you know, Aubrey, because, of course, that's just sort of what happens in high school. You don't really know why. You don't really choose the sort of material forces that put you in the same classroom or in the same lunchroom with someone. But once you're there, you just kind of have to make conversation because otherwise you just sit in silence, you know, while you're waiting for a class to start. Now, Daniel's reaction to this is to kind of run away. You know, he wants to get out to escape all of the violence that he's dealing with and eventually to move to New York and to just sort of pretend that he had never lived this life. One of the difficulties of this, of course, is that, you know, you can run as fast as you want. One is not able really to outrun the past. No one's fast enough, you know, and that's kind of the big difficulty of that kind of transcendence and that kind of leaving behind all of those really messy high school relationships. You know, ultimately they have shaped you, you know, even if you don't want to admit that or don't want to deal with the ways that they've shaped you. Additionally, I think if you do choose to return, there is something there for you. So to me, I think a big part of what that absence does is it kind of reminds why that kind of transcendence isn't really possible. You know, I mean, in some ways, when Daniel moves to New York and wants to sort of like live a different life, what he wants is he's acting as though he can just sort of pretend that this history had never happened. But that's not really on the table. When Aubrey dies, he then sort of has to confront this loss and then wants to go back in time. That's also not on the table. So he has to sort of find a kind of really difficult middle ground between that kind of rejection or pretense that the past could not have happened and the sort of acceptance and living with what has happened. That to me is the story of that book.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. Another question for you, nonfiction versus fiction. I know that you're working on an academic book, how does the process differ for you? What I guess the question is, which do you enjoy the most? Do you prefer writing fiction, or do you prefer writing nonfiction?
Oh, definitely fiction. I mean, what sociopath says nonfiction?
I know, well, there are some.
Oh, this is terrible. That sounds awful, you know? Sorry, I shouldn't be so mean. People can like whatever they like. Let me not yuck someone else's yum. Yeah, I much prefer writing fiction. You know, I mean, I think fiction's different to me. I mean, I think in some ways what I do when I write fiction is I find an emotion that I feel deeply and I let that guide the prose, you know? And I think that I tried to do that in this book as well with any number of emotions, you know? And that is really moving and really meaningful to me, I think, to be able to sit in that. It's important, of course, to know that that emotion is not you after a certain point, even if it's making the book, you know? I think there were any number of times when I was working on the manuscript and was just like kind of thrown back to periods early in my grieving for someone, and that could be quite difficult. So it was important for me to remember that, you know, the emotion made the book, but it didn't necessarily make me. I think additionally, you know, most importantly to me, fiction enables you to do all sorts of strange and different things. You know, for me, when I was writing this book, I wrote this book in part about someone whose life was quite different from mine in many ways, because I couldn't actually confront the loss that I was dealing with directly, you know. And I think that this is kind of one of those things that's amazing and magical about fiction, right? It enables you to deal with things that you're not able really to confront directly, that you're not able to really see in the real world by way of that kind of swerve or misdirection that is fictionality. I think that this is what is most enjoyable to me about fiction, you know, that it enables us to sort of disrupt what is real. And you know, that can be a reminder that everything that is around us is in fact constructed and can be built differently.
Were there any great revelations while you were writing, things, unexpected things that happened while you were writing that came out of the blue?
Yeah. Okay. So when I was writing this book, I was like, I'm going to like make some rules for prose. I want this to have a certain style, what have you. And then this character named Desmond appeared, who would not shut up, who took up so much space on the page. I think Desmond ends up being like, you know, one of my favorite parts of the book. It's really great. That was really hard for me though, early on, you know, because I was like, well, I
up to Desmond.
Yeah, you know, it's like I have all these ideas, but this other guy is just taking this everywhere else, you know, and that's not what I want to do. And I think that was good, you know. I mean, I had to sort of get over my own shit, you know, my own sort of like desire for control or whatever, to like listen to Desmond and let him take up space and let him direct you, you know. I mean, I think, and many people say this, I don't want to sort of claim any credit here, but you know, I think you really know you have a novel when your characters start talking back to you. You know? Desmond started talking to me, and I was really grateful for that and lucky to just sort of transcribe him or Egypt or Jess or any number of other characters.
I've heard that many times from different writers, that, you know, they have a prescribed path and all of a sudden some rogue character will come in and just kind of throw them completely off course in a good way, in a great way.
In a good way in the long run. At the time, you're like, please shut your mouth. You know?
Would you be kind of, do you have a passage prepared? We would love to hear some of the writing if you'd be kind enough to read to us.
Yeah. Why don't I read those first two paragraphs, like Elena suggested?
Yeah, that would be great.
This is on the first page. Back then, we body surfed until salt water rushed into our sinuses and pushed liquid mucus out our noses. When we tired of trying to catch the tide, we waded out, stopping to dive under incoming waves. Above us, the rushing water sounded like wind heard from within a plane landing. We surfaced and continued out to where we could not touch. We treaded and bobbed in the tide and congregated on sandbars. When that exhausted us, we swam back to shore and baked in the sun until the day turned to a haze of half sleep. We lived for water, salt, fresh, and brackish. We waited out school days for the weekends and school years for the summers to return to it. We stood on our river's mud shores and cast lines, hoping to catch something big, only ever reeling in catfish. We wriggled our hands into their mouths, unhooked their slimy insides, and tossed them back into our brackish river. After sweat and spray coated our faces, we kicked off our flip-flops and swam in murky waters. When the sun stole our shade, we moved on to the next shore or pier or dock or dinghy. We were all waiting for life after high school, after our no-name town in North Florida. So we figured we'd wait by the water.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I'll put a last call out for questions. If we don't have any more, I don't think we do. Let me just check. I've got one down here. No. Okay. Well, I would like to thank you both for joining us this evening and for a lovely discussion. If you have not already read the book, I have a feeling that a lot of our audience have not yet, and I would really advise that you do. We have signed copies of All the Water I've Seen Is Running. They are available at oblongbooks.com. I'd also like to express my thanks not only to Alane and to Elias, but also to Erin Lovett of WW Norton, who helped make this event possible. And I would like to thank all of you for joining us this evening. And we wish you all a very good night.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Elias. Thanks, Alane.
Thank you so much. And that was beautiful, Elias.
Great.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful book, everybody. Please read it. I advise you. Thank you so much. Take care.
Have a good night.
Good night.